A 14-year-old boy is fading in the dirt, struck by a sniper's projectile. The shooter doesn't panic. He doesn't run. He calmly walks over to the fallen child, picks up a flat rock, and slides it under his head. This wasn't a burial rite. It was a chilling, deadly signature. The frontier was actually controlled by ruthless mercenaries, bankrolled by the wealthy elite to quietly eliminate their rivals. The Wild West was built on dark money, and this boy was the receipt. To catch a phantom who leaves absolutely no physical evidence, a traditional frontier standoff is completely useless. By the early 20th century, the American West was transitioning, but the brutal mechanics of corporate greed were still firmly running the state of Wyoming. The immensely wealthy cattle barons operated like an untouchable mafia, funding a secret network of elite trackers to systematically eliminate their rivals. Law enforcement faced an impossible wall of silence. The authorities knew exactly who was removing the local homesteaders, but proving it in a corrupt court system was a logistical nightmare. The prime suspect was a highly trained, deeply paranoid operative protected by the deepest pockets in the livestock industry. You could not simply outgun a predator of this caliber on the open plains. To bring him down, the police had to engineer a flawless psychological trap. They had to weaponize his own towering arrogance. This critical necessity birthed one of the most brilliant and terrifying undercover sting operations in the history of American justice. Deputy United States Marshal Joe LaForce took the lead. Lee Force was a hardened veteran who understood the specific, fatal vulnerability of legendary frontier mercenaries. Despite their cold nature, these men suffered from a desperate, insatiable need for professional validation. They possessed massive egos and craved absolute recognition for their expertise. LaForce decided to exploit that exact psychological blind spot. He orchestrated a masterful deception. LaForce forged a highly confidential letter and ensured it reached the suspect. It was not a warrant or a threat. It was a highly lucrative job offer. LaForce posed as a discreet middleman representing a wealthy syndicate of ranchers up in Montana. The letter proposed a long-term contract to hunt wolves. In the dark, unspoken language of the frontier underworld, hunting wolves was the universal code for targeting human rivals. The bait was incredibly rich, offering a staggering salary of $125 a month. This proposition was perfectly calibrated. It offered a massive financial payout, a fresh territory, and the ultimate stroke to his ego. It confirmed to the operative that his dark reputation was widely respected, and his unique skills were still in absolute demand. The trap was set inside the unassuming United States Marshal's office in Cheyenne. This was not a secure interrogation facility. It was a simple wooden room about to host a high-stakes psychological war. Before the suspect walked through the door, LaForce positioned the invisible teeth of his snare. He brought in a trusted court stenographer named Charles Ownhouse and another heavily armed deputy. LaForce hid them in a freezing, cramped alcove directly behind the heavy office door. They were ordered to remain in absolute, suffocating silence. Ownhouse crouched in the shadows, gripping a sharpened pencil over a blank notepad, his hands likely shaking from pure adrenaline. The physical stakes in that tiny room were astronomical. The man walking into the trap was a remorseless, heavily armed phantom who had survived decades of frontier violence. if he heard a single floorboard creak or the faint scratch of a pencil lead against paper. The sting operation would instantly mutate into a catastrophic disaster. LaFours would be trapped at point-blank range, and the unarmed civilian hiding behind the door would be entirely defenseless. This was a primitive, analog wiretap, executed without a safety net. When the heavy door swung open, the suspect swaggered in with the absolute confidence of a man who believed he was completely untouchable. He viewed LaFours not as a threat, but as an inferior colleague brokering a lucrative deal. LaFours played his undercover role with chilling perfection. He was highly respectful, instantly offering his guest a stiff glass of whiskey. This alcohol was the crucial catalyst. It was explicitly designed to lower the operative's paranoid defenses and continuously fuel his dangerous pride. As the liquor flowed, LaFours expertly steered the conversation toward the mechanics of their dark trade. He adopted the persona of an admiring student, expressing profound awe at the sheer logistical difficulty of the recent sniper attack that had terrified the territory. He casually asked how any marksman could successfully eliminate a 14-year-old boy in such rugged terrain without leaving a single trace. He stroked the predator's ego relentlessly, waiting patiently for the vanity to completely override the survival instinct. Behind the wooden door, Charles' own house held his breath. The heavy scent of whiskey and cigar smoke drifted through the cracks, a sickening reminder of the monster sitting mere inches away. Intoxicated by the liquor and his own inflated sense of superiority, the suspect leaned back and began to talk. He did not offer vague hints. He proudly delivered a meticulous, horrifying masterclass in premeditated tragedy. Ownhouse frantically transcribed every single word in the dark. The operative actively boasted about his physical endurance, explaining how he had removed his heavy boots and sprinted entirely barefoot across the jagged rocks. He explicitly detailed how this brutal maneuver allowed him to completely avoid leaving identifiable tracks, while simultaneously cutting off the terrified boy's only escape route. Then, the psychological trap snapped entirely shut. Reflecting on the brutal execution of a child, the suspect showed absolutely zero remorse. He evaluated the act with the cold, calculating pride of a craftsman reviewing his ultimate masterpiece. Leaning in closely, he delivered the chilling sentence that would permanently seal his fate. He confidently declared, "It was the best shot that I ever made, and the dirtiest trick that I ever done." In the freezing shadows, the pencil lead carved that exact quote into history. It was a devastating, undeniable confession. The first half of the sentence highlighted his dark obsession with marksmanship, but the second half proved absolute, conscious malice. Acknowledging it was the dirtiest trick he had ever done, demonstrated clear premeditation. Proving he knew he was executing a cowardly ambush rather than fighting a fair battle. The legendary, untouchable phantom of the Wyoming plains had just voluntarily handed his own life to the justice system. He was not brought down by a massive posse or a faster draw. He was completely destroyed by his own uncontrollable vanity and the quiet, persistent scratching of a stenographer's pencil. The myth of the heroic cowboy was violently shattered in that room, replaced by the pathetic reality of a bragging mercenary who underestimated the evolving power of modern law enforcement. The jagged ridges of Iron Mountain, Wyoming, were a massive, open-air battleground, Forget the cinematic illusions of noble pioneers. The vast expanses of this prairie were the staging ground for a vicious, one-sided class war. At the top of the economic food chain sat an untouchable oligarchy of wealthy livestock tycoons. These cattle barons operated massive corporate empires, viewing the endless ocean of grass as their exclusive kingdom. But a new wave of desperate settlers threatened that monopoly. Immigrant farmers and stubborn sheep herders started claiming legally granted parcels of dirt. They erected miles of barbed wire, severely disrupting the free-roaming grazing routes of the corporate herds. This territorial dispute ignited the infamous cattle wars. The wealthy tycoons viewed these struggling families as a financial infestation. Because they possessed virtually unlimited bank accounts, the cattle syndicates did not bother with civil lawsuits. They simply purchased the entire local justice system, buying the loyalty of regional judges and funneling bribes to county sheriffs. With the law neutralized, the barons needed a permanent, physical solution to cleanse their grazing lands. They required a specialized instrument of terror. They needed a phantom who could strike from the shadows and vanish without a trace. They found their weapon in a man whose existence was defined by hunting human prey, Tom Horn. Long before he accepted a corporate bounty from the Wyoming elite, Horn had established a terrifying professional pedigree. He began his dark career as an elite civilian scout for the military, operating deep within the most hostile desert environments. He possessed an uncanny ability to read the wilderness, tracking targets across solid rock where ordinary soldiers saw absolutely nothing. His tracking endurance was so advanced that he played a pivotal role in hunting down the legendary Apache resistance leader, Geronimo. During those grueling campaigns, Horn learned how to completely erase his physical footprint and ambush a target before they realized they were being hunted. Following his military service, he weaponized those survival skills for the private sector, becoming a highly feared operative for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Working as a detective taught him exactly how local law enforcement processed crime scenes and how to exploit the massive blind spots of rural policing. By the time he rode into Iron Mountain, he was a cold-blooded mercenary, uniquely qualified to execute a relentless campaign of psychological warfare against the highly vulnerable homesteaders. His tactical methodology out on the open plains was brutally effective. He completely rejected the romanticized notion of a fair Western standoff, relying entirely on the cold mechanics of a high-powered Winchester rifle. Horn would establish a concealed camp on the elevated ridges overlooking a targeted family's property. He would spend days silently observing their daily routines through his scope. He mapped their grazing routes, noted when the men worked alone, and calculated the exact wind trajectory required for a fatal shot. He blended completely into the desolate environment. When the perfect, isolated moment presented itself, he would strike from hundreds of yards away. The victims never even heard the echoing crack of the rifle. One moment, a homesteader was tending to a flock of sheep in the crisp morning air, and the next, he was violently struck down by an invisible force. The surviving homesteaders were instantly paralyzed by a suffocating terror. They could no longer step out onto their front porches without nervously scanning the distant ridgelines. Simple tasks like fetching water became incredibly dangerous gambles. They realized they were being actively hunted by an unseen predator who held absolute power over the valley. The sudden brutality of these sniper attacks was horrifying, but the calculated aftermath truly solidified Horn's dark legend. The cattle barons were paying him to completely shatter the psychological resolve of the entire farming community. They needed the surviving neighbors to abandon their land and flee in absolute panic. To achieve this, the operative required a highly visible, terrifying calling card. After the fatal projectile found its mark, Horn did not immediately flee the area. Instead, he would descend from his hidden vantage point and calmly walk directly up to the fallen figure. With absolute detachment, he would pick up a flat, ordinary rock from the harsh Wyoming soil and deliberately slide it beneath the head of the deceased. This bizarre action was not an act of fleeting mercy or a makeshift burial rite. It was a terrifying, heavily calculated message. That single, smooth stone was a physical receipt of his deadly corporate transaction. It was a stark warning, signaling that the victim had trespassed against the wealthy rulers of the territory. When a terrified sheriff was summoned to one of these remote crime scenes, they would see the stone resting under the victim's head and immediately understand the grim reality. They would quietly fill out the paperwork, intentionally list the cause of death as an unsolved ambush, and promptly bury the case file. The sniper received his dark money, the cattle barons reclaimed their grazing land, and the pioneer family received nothing but a shallow grave. This rocky signature became the ultimate symbol of the cattle wars. Deep in the heart of the fractured Wyoming landscape lay a bitter, highly personal feud over a specific stretch of valuable grazing land. Willie Nickell, a fiercely stubborn homesteader, had committed the ultimate frontier sin. He brazenly defied the unwritten laws of the territory by bringing a massive flock of sheep right into the dead center of traditional cattle country. This decision essentially painted a massive target on his own back. His immediate neighbor, a devoted cattle rancher named Jim Miller, viewed the sudden arrival of the sheep as a direct, aggressive insult to his livelihood and a severe threat to his family's survival. The tension between the two neighboring properties had steadily escalated from heated verbal arguments at the property line to violent physical threats. Willie Nickell absolutely knew he was a hunted man. He spent his days constantly checking the horizon for approaching riders, but he stubbornly refused to abandon the difficult life he had built from the dirt up. But the phantom waiting in the shadows did not care about the bitter politics of the grazing disputes. He only cared about executing the corporate contract. A midsummer morning on the frontier possesses a deceptively peaceful beauty just before the sun fully crests the surrounding ridges. The air is sharply cold, carrying the damp, earthy scent of wild sagebrush. For the pioneer families carving a fragile existence out of this unforgiving environment, the early dawn was a sacred, highly predictable routine. It was a quiet time for tending to the animals and physically preparing for the grueling labor of the long day ahead. On this particular morning, the Nickell farmhouse was relatively calm. The terrifying shadow of the livestock associations felt temporarily distant. But the pioneer dream was always incredibly fragile. The greatest, most primal fear, haunting every single mother and father who brought their children into this isolated wilderness, was not the threat of starvation or failing crops. It was the terrifying vulnerability of their own front door. It was the unspoken understanding that sudden, inexplicable violence could simply step out of the tree line and completely destroy their entire world in a fraction of a second. Willie Nickell was just 14 years old. He was entirely disconnected from the vicious, adult hatred festering between his father and the neighboring ranchers. He did not care about the shifting property lines or the wealthy barons sitting in their private clubs. He was simply a young boy tasked with a routine morning chore before breakfast. He needed to saddle his horse and ride out to the distant pasture to check on the family's flock. Because the early morning air was still biting with a severe, lingering chill, Willie made a simple, completely innocent decision that would tragically and permanently seal his fate. Before stepping out of the warm farmhouse, he reached for an extra layer of protection against the cold. He grabbed his father's heavy, oversized canvas coat and pulled his father's wide-brimmed hat down low over his eyes to block the rising glare of the morning sun. Buried entirely beneath the thick fabric and wool, the slight, 14-year-old frame of the child was completely obscured. From a distance, in the dim, shifting light of the dawn, he looked exactly like Kels Nickell. Less than a mile away, perfectly concealed within a jagged cluster of massive boulders near the property's main wooden gate, the sniper was patiently waiting. The operative had been holding his position in the freezing cold for hours, his breathing incredibly slow and controlled, his high-powered Winchester rifle resting steadily on the cold stone. He had meticulously studied the daily habits of the Nickell patriarch for days. He knew, with absolute certainty, that his target would eventually have to ride through that specific gate to access the grazing sheep. When he finally heard the faint, rhythmic sound of approaching hooves crunching against the loose gravel, the sniper slowly and silently adjusted his sights. He peered through the iron crosshairs and saw a solitary figure approaching on horseback, wearing the exact heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat he had been explicitly paid to hunt. The phantom did not pause to verify the target. He did not require a clear, illuminated view of the face beneath the brim. In his cold, highly mechanical mind, the visual confirmation of the clothing was entirely sufficient to execute the plan. He rested his finger on the trigger, exhaled completely to steady his hands, and applied a gentle, consistent pressure. The sudden, deafening crack of the rifle violently shattered the peaceful morning silence, echoing across the valley like a clap of thunder. The heavy-caliber projectile traveled across the open distance with devastating, unstoppable speed. Willie Nickell was struck directly. The massive, kinetic impact violently threw the 14-year-old boy backward, sending him tumbling off his panicked horse and crashing hard into the unforgiving dirt. The sheer, overwhelming panic of that exact moment is almost too horrific to comprehend. Willie was not a hardened, experienced gunfighter prepared for a sudden ambush. He was a terrified child, completely alone, suddenly plunged into an abyss of agonizing physical pain and absolute mental confusion. Losing his strength rapidly in the dust, struggling to draw a single breath, Willie desperately scrambled to his feet. Driven entirely by pure, blind survival instinct, the wounded boy began to run. He stumbled frantically toward the main gate, desperately trying to reach the perceived safety of his home, crying out for his mother and father in the empty landscape. Every single agonizing step was a desperate, failing fight against his own rapidly deteriorating body. He just wanted to go home. But the phantom waiting on the ridge was notoriously precise. He absolutely never allowed a target to escape his line of sight. Seeing the figure still moving in the distance, the operative calmly chambered another round, completely unfazed by the frantic struggle of his victim. A second, highly calculated shot echoed across the empty valley. The projectile struck the fleeing child, completely severing his desperate sprint for survival. Willie Nickell collapsed heavily near the wooden gateposts, his small body finally succumbing to the massive trauma. He faded completely alone in the dirt, staring up at the empty Wyoming sky, surrounded only by the indifferent prairie grass. The morning went completely silent once again. The sniper slowly descended from his elevated hiding place among the rocks and walked deliberately across the field toward the fallen figure to verify his work. It was only when he stood directly over the silent body and looked down at the pale, youthful face, completely stripped of the oversized hat, that he realized the catastrophic nature of his mistake. He had not successfully eliminated the stubborn sheepherder. He had brutally, senselessly taken down a 14-year-old child. This is the exact moment where the true, terrifying nature of the frontier operative is fully exposed. A normal human being, even a hardened criminal, would have been instantly consumed by a sickening wave of guilt, remorse, and absolute horror. They would have dropped their weapon and fled the scene in a state of sheer, uncontrollable panic. But this phantom was completely devoid of basic humanity. He looked down at the boy, registered the massive error, and simply proceeded with his dark, mechanical routine. With absolute, chilling indifference, his heart rate completely steady, he searched the dusty dirt around the boy's body. He calmly picked up a flat, smooth stone, knelt down in the dust, and deliberately placed it directly beneath the head of the fallen child. He left the ultimate, terrifying corporate receipt under the skull of an innocent boy. He intentionally ensured that when the frantic, heartbroken pioneer parents finally found their missing son, they would know exactly who had taken him. And they would understand that absolutely no one in the territory was safe from the reach of the wealthy elite. The courtroom in Cheyenne was completely transformed into a high-stakes political theater. The dust had barely settled on the tragedy, but the focus of the territory had already shifted away from seeking absolute justice and moved directly toward securing political power. The presiding judge and the lead prosecutor were both facing highly contested, incredibly difficult re-election campaigns in the upcoming cycle. They desperately needed a major, headline-grabbing conviction to prove to the terrified, restless public that they were actively cleaning up the lawless frontier. They did not necessarily want to find the exact man who pulled the trigger. They simply needed a famous, terrifying man to face the ultimate penalty in the town square. To guarantee a straightforward, uncomplicated path to a guilty verdict, the prosecution made a highly controversial and deeply corrupt decision right at the beginning of the legal process. They completely ignored the most obvious, mathematically logical suspects in the entire region. They intentionally refused to thoroughly investigate the neighboring Miller family, completely disregarding the bitter, violent boundary feud that had been boiling over for months. Jim Miller had a clear, undeniable motive to harm Kels Nickell, but the prosecution deliberately scrubbed the neighboring rancher from their suspect list. Instead, they tunneled their entire investigative focus onto the captured phantom, relying almost entirely on the drunken, heavily disputed confession recorded by the hidden stenographer in the marshal's office. However, the immensely wealthy cattle barons could not simply allow their premier, highly effective operative to be taken down without a massive fight. If their prized asset broke under the severe pressure of a permanent sentence, he could easily testify against them and expose the entire corporate syndicate operating across the Western Plains. To protect him and completely shield their own criminal liability, the livestock associations opened their massive, bottomless bank accounts. They hired the absolute most formidable, aggressive, and highly connected defense attorney in the entire state of Wyoming to systematically dismantle the prosecution's case. The defense lawyer launched a brilliant, highly calculated attack on the state's timeline, essentially destroying the prosecution's entire physical narrative. He presented compelling, verifiable witness testimony, placing the suspect at a completely different location. A staggering 20 miles away from the Nickell homestead, shortly after the fatal shots were fired on that July morning. From a purely logistical and mathematical standpoint, it was physically impossible for a single man to execute the act and cover that massive distance on horseback over the rugged, uneven Wyoming terrain in such an incredibly narrow window of time. Furthermore, the defense expertly painted the famous undercover confession not as a factual, legally binding admission of guilt, but as the pathetic, highly exaggerated boasting of a severely intoxicated man simply trying to impress a fellow lawman. The physical evidence simply did not support a conviction. The prosecution's political dream was rapidly crumbling in front of the packed gallery. By all standard legal metrics, the trial should have ended with a swift, decisive acquittal. The defense had successfully planted a massive, undeniable seed of reasonable doubt. But the American justice system relies heavily on trial by jury, placing the ultimate, terrifying power of fate directly into the hands of ordinary, working-class citizens. In this unique, highly unpredictable legal arena, raw physical evidence and strict timelines can suddenly be completely eclipsed by the psychological demeanor of the defendant sitting on the stand. The elite defense lawyer gave his client one crucial, absolutely vital instruction to ensure his survival. Keep your mouth shut, look incredibly humble, lower your eyes, and let the ironclad 20-mile alibi do the heavy lifting. But the phantom could not do it. He suffered from a terminal, deeply ingrained case of supreme arrogance. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life playing God on the open prairie, holding absolute power over the terrified homesteaders. He firmly believed that the wealthy cattle barons who controlled the state would never actually let him fall. He absolutely refused to sit quietly and play the role of a submissive, wrongfully accused victim in a crowded courtroom. Against the desperate, frantic advice of his legal counsel, he aggressively demanded to take the witness stand and testify in his own defense. This singular decision was the ultimate, catastrophic act of self-destruction. The exact moment he sat in that wooden chair, raised his right hand, and swore an oath. The entire trial completely mutated. He did not defend his innocence with quiet dignity or respectful denial. Instead, he treated the entire legal proceeding as a massive, highly entertaining joke. He openly sneered at the prosecutor, answering highly serious questions about a fallen child with sarcastic, heavily condescending remarks. He actively sparred with the legal counsel, openly challenging the authority of the court and radiating an unbearable, toxic aura of absolute superiority. He simply could not resist the overwhelming, narcissistic urge to boast to the packed room about his legendary tracking abilities, his unmatched marksmanship, and his extensive history of frontier violence. He genuinely thought he was proving to the entire room that he was the smartest, most dangerous, and most untouchable man in Wyoming. He thought he was winning a mental chess match against the prosecution. Instead, he was actively, aggressively sealing his own fate in front of the entire world. He completely alienated the 12 ordinary men sitting in the jury box. These jurors were struggling farmers, shopkeepers, and working-class citizens who deeply despised the wealthy cattle barons and the ruthless, invisible mercenaries they employed to enforce their will. When these 12 men looked at the witness stand, they did not see a wrongfully accused man protected by a solid geographical alibi. They looked directly into his eyes and saw the exact monster who had been terrorizing their vulnerable communities for years. They saw a cold, remorseless operative who possessed the exact psychological profile and the terrifying capacity required to strike a 14-year-old boy in the back and casually place a rock under his head as a signature. His monumental, unchecked ego completely annihilated his own airtight legal defense. His arrogant, defiant attitude successfully accomplished exactly what the corrupt prosecution and the massive lack of physical evidence could never achieve on their own. He handed them the conviction on a silver platter. The jury did not need to deliberate for long. They completely disregarded the conflicting 20-mile timeline. They ignored the missing weapon, and they bypassed the completely uninvestigated neighbor. They voted based entirely on the undeniable, terrifying malice radiating from the witness stand. They returned a swift, unanimous verdict of guilty. The judge, finally securing his much-needed, highly publicized political victory, swiftly slammed his wooden gavel and sentenced the legendary frontier phantom to face the ultimate penalty. The most feared, untouchable corporate operative of the American West was not ultimately defeated by a brilliant detective, a flawless forensic investigation, or a fair and balanced justice system. He was completely, utterly destroyed by his own uncontrollable hubris, proving that even the most calculated shadow cannot outrun his own nature. That catastrophic display of ego in the courtroom paved a direct, inescapable path to the gallows. But as the freezing dawn of his final day broke over the Cheyenne jail, the legendary tracker did not exhibit a single ounce of fear or regret. The cold, cramped holding cell was thick with the heavy, pungent smoke of a premium cigar. He sat completely relaxed, exhaling slowly into the dim, shadowy light. He firmly refused the presence of a priest and offered absolutely no final dramatic confession to clear his conscience or ease the pain of the grieving family. He was determined to face the abyss with the exact same cold detachment he had used to fill the Wyoming graveyards. At his specific request, The haunting, melancholic voices of his friends, the Irwin brothers, echoed down the damp stone corridor, singing a high-pitched, mournful rendition of the folk song, "Life is like a mountain railroad." It was a bizarre, almost beautiful contrast to the grim mechanical reality waiting just outside his iron door. The authorities had constructed a highly unusual, completely automated device to carry out the sentence. To avoid placing the heavy psychological burden of physically pulling a lever on any single lawman, they engineered a water-powered trapdoor. A hidden valve slowly dripped water into a wooden bucket resting on a delicate trigger mechanism. Once the bucket reached a specific, critical weight, the floor would simply vanish. The only sound cutting through the heavy, suffocating silence of the chamber was the slow, rhythmic, agonizing trickle of that water. It was the literal ticking clock of the dying West. When the time finally came to position him over the drop, the contrast between the condemned and his captors was absolutely terrifying. The local deputies, tasked with strapping the thick leather belts around his arms and legs, were visibly trembling. Their hands shook violently, fumbling with the heavy buckles. The operative, standing firmly on the wooden trapdoor, remained as still and silent as a stone. Even as the heavy, suffocating black hood was pulled tightly down over his face, plunging him into total, inescapable darkness, his arrogant spirit completely refused to break. Sensing the nervous, shaking hands of the deputy beside him, the phantom's muffled voice echoed through the thick canvas. He delivered one final, chilling punchline. "What is the matter?" He casually joked into the dark void. "Are you afraid I will tip over?" Moments later, the rising water finally breached the mechanical threshold. The wooden trapdoor violently snapped open, and the heavy line ripped taut with a sickening crack. But the meticulous, highly calculated operative was subjected to a deeply flawed, agonizingly clumsy exit. The mechanical drop had been severely miscalculated. The fall was far too short to provide a clean, merciful end. Instead, the heavy knot slowly tightened. For 17 excruciating, horrifying minutes, his body hung suspended in the cold air. But the heart of the legendary frontiersman fiercely refused to stop beating. The attending physicians stood by and listened in absolute, stunned silence as that stubborn, violent muscle fought against the inevitable, echoing through the chamber for 17 endless minutes before finally fading into permanent silence. He passed away without ever officially confessing to the tragedy of the 14-year-old boy, taking the deepest, darkest secrets of the wealthy livestock associations straight to the grave. But when that heart finally stopped beating in the dark, it dragged an entire era down with it. The untouchable, bloody power of the corporate cattle barons was fundamentally broken. The lawless age of the American frontier was officially dead, swinging quietly at the end of a waterlogged rope. The final drop ended his life, but the mystery survived. For over a century, historians have fiercely debated whether he was actually guilty or just a convenient scapegoat sacrificed by the wealthy elite. Astonishingly, a 1993 mock trial reviewed the evidence and completely acquitted him. The absolute truth remains buried in the Wyoming dirt. The smoke has cleared, and that closes the file on today's case. What are your thoughts on this dark chapter of the Wild West? Let us know in the comments below. If you liked this video, hit the subscribe button to join American Ghosts as we continue to uncover the shadows of 19th century America's past. Until next time, the journey to expose the crimes continues.